Hello, thank you for waiting for me. My apologies. So now what we're going to do is the Cold War. Same type of whatchamacallit of format and pedagogy. They're in argumentative form. I have to admit, I'm not that impressed with my choice of my choice of discourse. It's not that intellectually deep. I could have gone the route of trying to say, try to get into how um, the Cold War affected other countries globally, on a geopolitical scale, economic scale. There were lots of routes we could go. We could get further into the subject of brinkmanship, and what brinkmanship is when you utilize the ability to threaten someone militarily to get what you want diplomatically. And so, hence, when we had the monopoly for a short period on atomic weaponry, that's a clear case in point. So there were lots of directions I could have gone, and but I didn't. Instead, I kind of focused upon what they call the blame game. All right. So again, it's not as deep, but hopefully there's enough information when you read all the sections that you will have learned the basics of the Cold War. Okay. So firstly, um, I try to set the stage on section number one, and basically I'm saying that that Western capitalism and Republican form of government were those economic and political systems were incompatible with communism. All right. They stressed different things. They feared different things. They had vastly different goals, and therefore I'm setting the stage that even during World War II, when we were allies with Soviet Russia, that we were kind of strange bedfellows at best, just an odd couple that did not get each other, that even had ideological and historical reasons to distrust and even dislike each other, but we shared a common enemy in the Axis powers, right? So it is of not to surprise to many historians that we ended up finding ourselves in the Cold War uh, almost immediately at the end of World War II. All right. I just defined to myself the Cold War as a period of ideological and geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. When we largely fought by proxy, whereby we would support and help a country that was fighting against the other, but that we didn't go toe to toe and fight each other. So, hence the term Cold War. All right. So, at any rate, so let's see here. With Marxism, right, with Karl Marx and so forth, the very origin of his book, right, or his books, Das Kapital, the Communist Manifesto, etc., emanated from what he saw as completely morally and economically wrong with capitalism, right? What he saw was a burgeoning plutocracy, a rule by the rich. Okay. We went into that thesis when we covered the West. Remember, we did it early this semester. We did Frederick Jackson Turner's romantic thesis about the West, how it supposedly opened up equality of opportunity for everybody because of the equal and indiscriminate dangers and opportunities therein. And remember, the last section was a kind of a Marxist critique of that, and it contended that the corporations in particular took over mining, they took over ranching, and they took over farming, the key industries in the West. And so to him, right, the capitalist system it's heartless, it's Darwinian. It is set up for the bigger guys to gobble up the smaller guys. All of America's rhetoric about the American dream to them was hollow propaganda, contending that, of course, if the rich are exploiting and deliberately keeping the poor and the proletariat, they were big on the proletariat, the manual laborers in the industrial era, keeping them down and benefiting from such, that they knew they had to give them false hope. And that false hope, right, was that by merit, by individual exertion of hard work and enterprise and ambition, etc., you can join us, right? But of course, that to the Marxists, that was hollow. That was to keep them from rebelling. And of course, they thought they used they used the ideological justification of social Darwinism in saying that they were meant, that there was a sense of fairness, the robber barons, that is, big business, to their victory, and that they earned it, right? And we had that in the Gilded Age Part 1 assignment, when I called it Giving the Devil His Due, and showing how Rockefeller and Carnegie worked so diligently and intelligently to get to where they were. And of course, they had lucky breaks and connections. They couldn't deny that. But to the Marxist, that's just justification. That's just justification for a parasitical situation, so that the rich benefit from the suffering of the poor. Okay, and they don't want the proletariat in particular. They want them to do the backbreaking work for them, and to keep them submerged. Okay, then in addition to that, you had writings from Marx and Engels and others who contended that it was universal in its theme, and it was saying that even nationalism is propaganda. It's what they called false consciousness, right? So if I ask you, what are you? What was the first thing that came to your head? Was it man, woman? Was it a gender issue to you initially, instinctively? Was it your religion? Was it your ethnicity? Was it your nationality? Was it your age? And it can go on, right? But to the Marxist writers and to Vladimir Lenin and those who initiated the Bolshevik Revolution, trying to follow the Marxist writings in the Soviet Union, those are all examples of false consciousness. What you really, truly, first and foremost, aren't and should not immediately identify yourself as. To them, right, it's all about your socioeconomic position or your class that you're in, right? What you do for a living, if you work with your hands or not for a living, etc. So to them, right, there began early calls to an international revolution. You could see this and detect it as early as the middle of World War I, where Marxist organizations throughout Europe decried, hey, soldiers, most of you are members of the proletariat, forced by Germany, Austria, Hungary, England, France, Russia, etc. You guys are mere pawns, all of you, fighting for these parasitical leaders. You need to shed your sense of nationalism and identify with one another as the same class of exploited people who are sent to fight and die for your rich country counterparts. And so at any rate, that gives kind of I hope that gives a basic introduction to Marxism. So to them, right, what they were not solely, that's the wrong adverb. They were primarily seemed to be occupied with was inequity and making equity out of that. And remember, inequity is basically unfairness, right? A lot of times the word inequity is tied to economics. When you have an inequitable society, you have a society in which a numerical small minority, for instance, controls most of the means of production, and they have everybody else, the masses, at their mercy to work for them or to rent their property etc. So at any rate, what they were primarily focused upon was equity. They wanted fairness. They wanted to go even so far as to do away with class differences and form at some point in the future a classless society, right? And some, of course, took the idea that including Marx himself, hoped that it could end up almost like a John Lennon song, like John Lennon's song "Imagine." Everybody in the world sharing everything. No need for any coercive institutions like government. No private property, and people just sharing the resources of the world. A little bit less utopian than that was syndicalism. And syndicalism stated that every locale that has its own unique geography and its own unique resources ought to democratically organize in a decentralized regime and decide for themselves, particularly the workers who are doing the backbreaking work, vote upon and decide for themselves how they're going to evenly allocate the fruits of their labor. All right, that was known as syndicalism. And the term Soviet in the Soviet Union supposedly is tied to that syndicalist notion of these quasi-independent local democratic entities that are deciding upon the allocation of the fruits of their labor. All right, so at any rate, the problem is, though, right, a bit like fascism, is with the communists that were in control, is they felt like, okay, if you're not on board with this, it's not going to work. So there was very little room in communist ideology for dissent, for going your own way, for disagreement, for opposition, etc. So hence, a lot of these communist countries have historically become rather coercive, right? So for instance, if they're going to take from the rich and allocate it to the poor, they're not asking for the rich's permission, right? If they don't like cultural and symbolic remnants of the old capitalist system, like only the wealthy being able to afford wealthy clothing and access to certain commodities and goods, then they contend, then you can't. And they'll restrict even something as seemingly mundane as what you wear. So there's not much wiggle room in a communist, historically, in a communist government for individual freedom. All right. Then you contrast that with the United States and capitalism and so forth, right? And we've talked about this, how influential, arguably, was the classical liberal movement in the 1800s. All right. John Stuart Mill was kind of its most famous writer. And basically, right, he contended that the individual, ought to be as autonomous as possible, that you as an individual ought to be able to do what you want for a living, go whatever route you want for your career, right? In the cultural realm, wear whatever you want, listen to whatever type of music you want, join whatever political party and affiliation and ideology and platform that you want to join. And the limitation for that was one time articulated pretty well, arguably, by a Supreme Court justice, where he said, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins," right? So saying that under classical liberalism and its ideology, that seems to be the main criterion, the main limitation to individual freedom, is that you could do what you want until it infringes upon a natural right of somebody else, on your neighbor. All right. So America, at least in its rhetoric, is so much about freedom, right? And so we easily look over to the Soviet Union and say, look at that. Look at the lack of freedom in those countries, and look what you're free to do. You know, something as seemingly trivial as a rock star that we once had, Bruce Springsteen. He tried to have a concert in the Soviet side of Berlin, and they almost let it happen. And then at the last minute, the Soviet authorities over Eastern Berlin said no. So it might be an exaggeration, but Americans pointed at the Soviet Union and said that they were totalitarian, meaning, right, that they tyrannically tried to dictate all of the facets of people's lives, even down to what kind of music they listened to and how they dressed, etc. And so that's what we focused on in our propaganda about what was so displeasing, scary about communism. And then as far as the plutocracy argument, of course, America, especially through the 50s, at this time period that we're covering, the 40s and 50s mainly, was not willing. The press wasn't even, much less the federal government, right, and the leading bureaucracy and the military establishment, etc. They were not willing to give up on those arguments that I had given on giving the devil his due. That yes, that is a product of capitalism. That is a bit unfortunate that some clearly win and some clearly lose, but that there's a sense of fairness to it, and that there is equality of opportunity, and not all people make as good advantage of that opportunity as others. Some aren't as lucky as others, etc. And that's just the way it is. So our sense of equity or fairness was much different from the Soviet Union. They wanted equality of condition, right? Where everyone ended up in the same economic condition. And we wanted merely equality of opportunity and let the chips fall where they may, as far as who succeeds and who doesn't. Okay, so that's my main argument here with number one. I'm trying to set the stage that we were very incompatible ideologically, us and the Soviet Union. The number two, culpability, right? Blame for Cold War leads to fingers pointed toward the U.S. So this is revisionist history, all right? And this is pointing to ways in which we exacerbated, right? We made worse any tentative distrust that Soviet leaders and the Soviet people already had of us as a capitalist country. All right. So for one, going back to the 19 teens under Woodrow Wilson, when the Bolshevik Revolution had begun, I believe 1917, and they began it went backwards into it retrograded back to a civil war between two groups. One supposedly was more moderate, and they were known as the white shirts or the Mensheviks, and the other one was more adamant about strictly and quickly adhering to the Marxist writings of communism, and they were known as the red shirts or the Bolsheviks. So you could take an easy guess as far as our government went as to which side we were officially hoping would win that civil war. And that, of course, was the more moderate party, the Mensheviks. So at that time, while it's going on, our country sent to Vladivostok 12,000 American soldiers. Now, the justification for doing so was that in the event, especially of the Bolsheviks winning, they were going to nationalize all foreign property, right, for Mother Russia. And remember, if I'm correct on this, which I hope, expropriation implies compensation, right? Where governments have decided, kind of like eminent domain here in this country, where they say, you know what, it's happened quite often, for instance, in Latin America, beneath us geographically, where United Fruit Company and these other oil and fruit and canal companies have just monopolistic power over entire countries and regions and over most of their fertile soil. And so from time to time, a government has come in and said, you know what, foreign American company, you are going to sell at least some of your land back to the government, and we'll compensate for you. We'll pay you for it at market price. But nationalization usually has entailed not a penny being paid to those big businesses, right? And just having them lose all their assets in resources and property in that country. So our government was fearful of that. And so their explanation for it was that they were sent to protect a couple key lobbyist powered railroad companies that they were afraid that were going to be their companies were going to be and property were going to be nationalized in the event of the Bolsheviks winning. But to the Bolsheviks, right, it looked like at any time they were there as a threat at the very least, and a threatful, menacing message, but also perhaps at any time they could get involved in trying to help the Mensheviks. So that left a sour taste in Soviet leaders' mouths for quite some time. Okay. Because again, imagine if it were the other way around. Imagine during our Civil War from 1861 to 65, if 12,000 British soldiers, began to be stationed in some major port city along the Atlantic coast of America. So at any rate, in addition to that, the Soviet Union begged us, and by that time the leader was Joseph Stalin, and he was a very prideful man, but he was not above begging the United States under Franklin Roosevelt to open up a Western Front after June 22nd, 1941, when the Soviet Union invaded, or the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, right? And so they were fighting them in the East, and they wanted us to sandwich them in the West to help alleviate the Soviet Union's military woes. Okay. Well, they asked us in 41, we declared war on the Axis powers at the very end, right? December 10th of 1941 of that same year. And the Western Front was attacked and opened on June 6th, D-Day, 1944. That's a long time dragging our feet, right? Now, granted, I've heard some somewhat intelligent defenses militarily why it took us so long to open up that Western Front. Remember, we went up the, quote, soft underbelly of Italy at first. Remember also, there's evidence diplomatically that this was a lot of Winston Churchill's doing of Great Britain more than it was Franklin Roosevelt. He seemed to be more going along with Churchill's plan, but it still did not, perception-wise, did not look good, right? It looked as if we were deliberately dragging our feet because we already distrusted and were strange bedfellows with the Soviet Union, and that we wanted to become the strongest, healthiest power standing at the end of the war. So it was in our best interest to let these two bad countries just battle it out and beat each other up before the U.S. would come to help save the day. It's a very cynical thought, but it was one that the Soviet leader, Premier Joseph Stalin, took very seriously. All right. Then there was the Ultra program that we've already spoken about, decoding the messages, right? Remember, Winston Churchill invited American emissaries to Bletchley Park, where they were using the Enigma machine, etc., to decode Nazi messages. He did not invite the Soviet Union emissaries, and neither did we. And as you may know, they say anywhere from 22 to 29 million people in the Soviet Union died during World War II. That is just staggering. And so how many lives might have been saved had we shared this Ultra program right off the bat with the Soviet Union so that they would know the military plans of the Soviet Union before they came into fruition. So just one more reason, right? So then you have that. And then also what I think I should have in there as well is the Lend-Lease Act. We had not declared war yet, right? And we technically violated international law because remember, as early as the War of 1812, it was cemented in the Crimean War in the mid 1850s, was this code of international law that entailed the demand that neutral countries, when other quote belligerent at war countries are fighting, right, that their private merchants, even their official government and official government connected banks can do business with either or all of the belligerent countries as long as it doesn't entail contraband, literally meaning against the list, that list of no's. And of course, on the top of that list, you could easily guess, is any type of weaponry or ammunition, because then you're not technically being neutral. You're helping one side against another. Well, Franklin Roosevelt tried some diplomatic, legal, ways of getting around it, but he broke that international law. So while we were still a neutral country, he began sending out military equipment to our allies. All right. Well, it's a fact that you could look up. The overwhelming lion's share of those resources went to Great Britain, not to Russia. Now, in our defense, we were sending supplies to the Soviet Union at Port Archangel, and it would freeze up for multiple months of the year. And also, the Nazi submarines were very deadly and shooting down our ships, trying to get the supplies to the Russians, losing our government a lot of money. And you have quotes from Franklin Roosevelt saying such and complaining of such and saying that it was like throwing money down a hole, trying to help the Soviet Union being so far away and having such cold climate. But that is not the way Soviet leaders interpreted it. They interpreted it as clear indication that the United States clearly favored Great Britain, because remember, France had already surrendered to Nazi Germany in Europe. Okay. And so, anyway, going on to number 2, the Soviet Union, especially under Joseph Stalin, constituted a grave threat to what modern Western civilization, excuse me, holds dear. That should be holds dearly. Those little English mistakes bug me. And President Truman heroically deterred the bully. So this clearly is great man history, right? Well, when you're looking into what caused what to happen and you're explaining a certain topic or time period, you believe the best way of getting to the truth of that time period is by looking at the leaders who are in great positions of power. So remember, great man history focuses upon the leaders of countries. It does not mean to imply that they are morally great people. Okay. I almost feel like that name is a misnomer. So at any rate, some core great man history here. All right, making a hero of Truman. Okay, Harry Truman. So when the Soviet Union, remember, Nazi Germany, as they were coming in toward Stalingrad, and they were stopped there, they split their army in half, actually into 3. A third went toward Moscow, and then a third went to the Caucasus Mountains, of course, because they were so rich in oil, and the Nazi war machine needed that oil. But in hindsight, historians say splitting their forces in 3 at that crucial time was a poor idea strategically. And then we've talked about how the people, the common people, were armed, at least to the extent that they had guns. They were giving guns out to the common people of Stalingrad, the civilians, telling them to fight to the death, to the last man for Stalingrad, because Stalin and his ego didn't want his city that was named after him to fall. And so a lot of people to this day contend that this was the beginning of the downfall of Nazi Germany, losing in, I believe, the winter of 43, in Eastern Russia. So the tide turns, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet army begins pushing back the Soviet Union. Another battle that was key was Kursk, a big tank battle, and the Nazis were humbled there as well. So the Soviet Union starts pushing them back westwardly, and they go back into these countries, right, of Central Europe, heading back toward Germany, that had off and on been taken over by other countries and empires. Okay, we talked about that with World War I, like Austria, Hungary, right, as an example in that region. But they would intermittently get their independence. And so they, at the end of World War I, in the name of self-determination, remember, with the 14 points and all that of Woodrow Wilson, they were granted self-determination and freedom and independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and from Germany. And so they had newly regained their national sovereignty, their independence as countries. Well, when the Soviet Union came through them, the Soviet Union dealt with them tyrannically and mercilessly. So, for instance, there was an anti-fascist political party in Poland that was really strong, and the Soviet Union, was afraid of that, and they were clear, right, that they had expansionist aims to try to spread communism eventually globally, right, in the name of the equity for the common proletariat worker. So at any rate, they were bothered, they were concerned with that fact in Poland. So they have footage of the Soviet troops going to a certain Polish river and just stopping and refusing to cross it and allowing the Nazi army to massacre Polish soldiers, to deliberately weaken them and to discredit their anti-communist regime there in Poland. And so they took their sweet time crossing that river to go into Poland. And then when that was done, they had mass killings. We know that now for sure. There were mass executions of Poles for reasons I forget. I apologize, by the Soviet army and government. Yugoslavia, Romania, these other countries, Austria, same thing. They would actually not quite the same thing. They came in and they kept their Soviet T-34 tanks in the capitals of these countries, and they demanded a new referendum, a new popular vote on their parliamentary and for their prime minister, etc. Right? But we have clear evidence that they were using violence. They were using what's that legal term? Extortion, right? Where you say you do this or else, and you threaten them with something. The Soviets were using violence, extortion, assassinations, of course, ballot stuffing, putting in fake names, and cheating in the elections. We know those things happened to manipulate a majority party victory for the communist parties in those countries. So hence, it may not have been too strong of an exaggeration for conservatives in America to call these countries Soviet puppet governments, okay, as the Soviet Union began supposedly liberating them, in quotes, from Nazi Germany. So Franklin Roosevelt was aware of this, and he supposedly, was non-confrontational. He was very suave, very sneaky, but he just was not that type of personality to take someone on head to head. He'd rather do it in a more suave manner. And so they said that they were very surprised for him to even get a verbal agreement, which of course Stalin refused to put in writing, at one of the conventions during World War II of the Allies. Supposedly verbally, Joseph Stalin promised that he would allow free and fair elections in those that were now being called satellite countries that he was, quote, liberating, especially Poland. And I don't recall the reasons why, but Poland was a bigger deal to our government than the other countries. So Franklin Roosevelt dies in office in the midst of his fourth term. And in comes a completely different personality, according to this narrative, and that's Harry Truman. Harry Truman, to some people, had a little bit of a little man's disease complex. He was very quick to be offended in some cases and very prideful, and was apt to show that he was not to be taken for granted and not to be shown disrespect, etc. One of the more comical examples of that was when he would subsequently be elected as president, and subsequently elected because he had to take in the term as the vice president, obviously. But then he actually ran when that term was done of Roosevelt's. And about that time, there was a journalist who made fun of his daughter at there was a gala, and she performed musically, and he was so proud of his daughter, President Truman. And the guy wrote ill of her, and they have it in writing of him literally telling the guy that if he happens to meet him on the street, that he was going to beat him up. And so, by a lot of accounts, this Midwestern Missouri guy was a completely different personality from the suave, non-confrontational Franklin Roosevelt. So immediately when they meet again for the first time with this new U.S. president at this International Allied Conference in Yalta, remember, that's on Soviet soil. That did not deter or intimidate Truman at all. But he immediately went to a guy named Molotov, who was one of the main ambassadors at the Soviet Union, and he gets in his face and begins berating him and his country for not making good on the verbal promise that Stalin had made, that he was going to allow free and fair elections in Poland and the other satellite countries. All right. Also, it didn't take long from there for him to make a suggestion with a smile on his face, supposedly whispered in the ear of Stalin, "We have a new weapon that I think you'll find interesting." And we're going to get back to that, because some people think that he wielded that in bully fashion to try to make. I mean, he even has a quote to one of his cabinet members, President Truman, where he said, "I think this bomb," basically as a loose paraphrase, "is going to make Stalin more manageable, more pliable diplomatically, because it's going to scare him, basically." All right. And then in addition to that, we had what was known as the Atlantic Charter between Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill. And in it, the key to it, right, was stating that the Allies are the good guys in World War II because they uphold the dignity and humanity of every individual in the world, and that they were fighting for the natural human rights of citizens everywhere against fascism in particular, right? So along with that, with the idea of natural rights, was the right to join whatever political affiliation you want, vote for whom you want, run for office if you like, etc. And Stalin's regime was clearly denying that to his satellite countries, in clear violation of the Atlantic Charter. All right. And you got to remember also, Truman had read about the atrocities under Stalin. I believe it was like 1936 or so. He had his worst purge of his military leaders. And I can no longer recall the numbers, but it was just ghastly under these kangaroo courts. And remember, with a kangaroo court, it's implied that you're going to be guilty. You're going to be found guilty no matter what, even if you're blatantly innocent. They've already decided before they put you on trial. Now, they attribute that to Stalin's paranoia. And they also attribute it to his Machiavellian manipulative tactics of getting rid of anybody who he thought in the present or any time in the future might pose a threat or be a rival to him in the future, to have them dealt with before that happened. So they were declared guilty of not of being disobedient to him as the great leader and premier of the Soviet Union. They were found guilty of going against the writings of Karl Marx, which is a bit ironic because Stalin did not faithfully adhere to the writings of Marx, and his critics made it known, and he ruthlessly dealt with those critics. Remember, this is the same guy that was a rival to oh gosh, oh, someone could help me. The gentleman who went down to Mexico, he was the intellectual. He was like the Thomas Jefferson of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he warned Vladimir Lenin before Lenin died pretty early that Stalin was not interested in the things of Marxist ideology, but was a power-hungry lunatic who was out for himself. Okay. And anyway, when Stalin forcefully took control as the premier over the Politburo, the so-called parliament of the Soviet Union, he fled. He fled to Mexico. Well, he was infamously killed, supposedly with an ice pick, down in Mexico on the orders of Stalin. All right. This is the same Stalin also that when Nikita Khrushchev took over as premier when Stalin died in 54, thereabouts, Khrushchev did a denunciation campaign saying he was not going to be like his predecessor. And he openly allowed the press to gain access to some of the awful atrocities that Stalin had been guilty of. So Truman was aware of those things. Okay. So Truman clearly thought that Stalin was the prototypical bully and that he had dealt with bullies his whole life. And that, according to his estimation, bullies only speak one language. You can't diplomatically compromise with them. You can't shame them and get them to change their ways, but you have to literally scare them from being ruthless. And so hence the term deterrence, right? And when I think of deterrence, I think of someone having a sign on his or her house warning people that he or she has a guard dog, or that the owners of the house are armed with weapons, right? You're not going out of your way to try to win over your local neighbors. You're not believing in the best part of human nature, but rather the opposite. You're assuming the worst, and you're assuming that there's at least a demographic of people who have to become scared of preying upon you. And that was the kind of simple outlook of President Truman. And on number two, we're defending that outlook and saying that that's exactly true, that Stalin was a bully and that Truman was the perfect guy, almost providentially becoming president at just the right time to stand up to this bully. All right. Then another thing he did other things as well. Within his own administration. Remember back to the Bolsheviks. They had the Cheka, the secret police, and you had all these other paramilitary and diplomatic branches that came from the Cheka, right? Collectively known as the Soviet secret police. They engaged in espionage. They bugged phones. They arrested people without a warrant. They assassinated people, like I mentioned. They arrested people without due process. They were the ruthless arm of the Soviet government, all right, to fight against enemies from within and abroad. So Truman initiates lie detector tests in the White House and forces all major federal bureaucrats to take the lie detector test, that they were not Soviet spies, that they had no communist sympathies or communist connections, etc. In addition to that, he also encouraged the beginning of the arms race. Okay. And with the arms race it's kind of predicated under the philosophy again of deterrence. Is he tried to almost bully and shame and manipulate our Congress into telling them they need to spend more and more money of the federal budget into military enrichment, right? Just in case or in the event of going to war with the Soviet Union. And that even if we did not eventually go to war, to him, right, the Soviet, through their spies, etc., would become intimidated by how militarily fit we were becoming, that they would dare not try to cause a war with us. All right, so known as the arms race. Truman is sometimes tied to the origins of that. And then in addition to that, he formed the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And with the CIA, they, as we know now, they were guilty of acting in a manner almost befitting the behavior of the Soviet secret police. They were sent as spies to a lot of neutral countries and even allies to us in foreign countries. They were sent to manipulate elections as best they could. When someone was found guilty of, in the CIA's estimation, of being guilty of Soviet espionage, of trying to move their country into the orbit of communism and the Soviet Union's sphere of allies, they could become assassinated. And our CIA, of course, was behind multiple assassinations. So Truman really threw some fuel on the fire of the Soviet Union. But in his estimation, right, it was not only necessary in dealing with the Soviet Union led by Stalin in particular, but that it was also useful, right? For one reason, like I mentioned, deterrence. To let the Soviet Union know that we could use the same methods, that we were up for their challenges. Okay. And not to mention to keep as many allies militarily as we could, as I'll briefly mention NATO in the future. And then in addition to that was the Iron Curtain speech and the subsequent Truman Doctrine. Okay. So in this, supposedly, I don't know about Truman himself, but the press, many members of the government supposedly were genuinely surprised by this speech, that they didn't see it coming. Truman may have. I don't know. But Winston Churchill traveled on a tour here in the US as a war hero and our ally in World War II. He's no longer the Prime Minister of England. And so he's got some free time and so forth, right? And he goes to Fulton, Missouri, and he gives a college graduation speech. Well, that speech was a lot grander in vision than any type of, motivational speech to college grads. In it, he contends that every generation has its own bully nation. They've always had one. And that as soon as one falls, it seems as if another one takes its place as the menace to the liberties and the national independence of its neighbors and other countries. And you know where I'm going with this. He said, no sooner did the Axis powers fall by the summer of 45 that we now already have a new global bully in the form of Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union. And he said, an iron curtain is slowly descending all across Europe. Okay. And under that iron curtain, the people are miserable. The people are devoid of their independent rights and freedoms. The people are at fear of being thrown in prison without due process, or even worse, being shot on the streets. And he was real hyperbolic. And he says, thankfully, Providence always seems to equip a rival country, a rival power, to hold that bully at bay. And he said, you, United States, are that good guy. Because, with our gross national product and our economy, unemployment rates, our military machine, by many different indices, we were kind of the strong giant standing, because England had done a lot more fighting for 2 more years than we had, and was almost invaded by Nazi Germany. And so they had been broken down much more. So imagine that, right? Someone points out a guy in your classroom, says, this guy is your bully, and then points to you and says, I believe it's your job to take care of that bully. Well, taking the personality that I've just described, kind of simplistically, because everybody's more complex, right, in reality. But the image that you have in this number of Truman, it should be of no surprise that he welcomed that challenge. And he welcomed it largely on account that it's going to largely, the Truman Doctrine is going to be more passionately adhered to. It's going to be more popularly embraced in America, before I get to the Truman Doctrine, by a single event. Okay, if you don't mind me just for a moment. George S. Kennan, he was in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union knows he's there. He's invited to the Politburo meeting. They know he's fluent in the Cyrillic Russian language. Nevertheless, Stalin gets up before the Politburo and says, we need more money spent on the military for the inevitable, the unavoidable war against our capitalist enemies. And of course, Kennan knew who exactly he was primarily talking about, and that was the United States. So in the middle of the night here, he sent a rushed telegram to the White House saying Stalin is telling his Politburo to equip themselves and the military for a war against the United States. And it's known as the Kennan Telegram. So at any rate, with Truman, going back to the Truman Doctrine right here, anywhere an unarmed majority within any country on the globe is threatened by the forceful imposition of communism by an armed minority or foreign power will receive American military help. This is the beginning of America being known as the world's policeman. But notice an assumption that was typical of Harry Truman. Is he's assuming, right, that nowhere would a majority of peaceful people actually want communism. That communism is always imposed by the use or threat of force. And as we get into Vietnam, you're going to see that assumption highly challenged. So he is going to protect the majority of people in any given country that are threatened by an armed coup of a numerically small military communist party in their own country that's trying to take their country over, or a separate communist country actually invading their borders to impose communism on them. Either one. He said the U.S. will commit to helping that country. As you might know, that's going to directly link us to the Korean War and to Vietnam. All right. So it's interesting to me, the juxtaposition here. All right. Korea, the Korean Peninsula have been taken over by Mongolians, Manchurians, the Chinese, the Japanese. They were kind of like Poland in those Central European countries. They'll have their independence in human history at times, and then they lose it to an empire, and then they gain it back, and then they lose it, etc., etc. Well, during World War II, Japan took all of Korea and occupied it. All right. So during its liberation, we came in the Pusan Peninsula in the south of that Korean peninsula that goes down into the ocean, right? And we sent our troops there and we began fighting against the Japanese to liberate it, as we were elsewhere in the Pacific and in Asia. Well, this was getting toward the end of the war. It was one of the last countries liberated. And in our defense, it was somewhat at the last minute. Okay. And also, why didn't Joseph Stalin help us elsewhere? The Marianas, the Solomon Islands, all these island chains, we were on our own, except for some of the British allies, but certainly not the Russians. They weren't helping us. They were willing to help us if we were to fight in Manchuria. And of course, we figured that was only because Russia had historically always been interested in Manchuria, but nowhere else. So why, right? Why toward the end of the war does almost in last minute fashion, does Stalin decide to send Soviet troops to the northern part of Korea, of the Korean Peninsula? So our president and administration and military establishment, they did not trust this guy, right? And they figured that he knew the end was in sight of the war. He knew, which happened to be true, as Japan itself, right, that we did not just liberate and leave some of these Pacific and Asian countries. We stayed years afterward, supposedly trying to rebuild them, but forming our own military bases, etc. Engaging in our own self-interest, for sure, as well, in such countries. So he had good reason to know that Korea, the Americans in Korea, were not going to leave as soon as the Japanese surrendered. So that he likely wanted to share the loot of Korea and have his soldiers stay there as well at the end of the war. So already we were very, very distrustful and suspicious of such action. Well, the war ends, and actually Soviet soldiers were en masse. I'm sure there were exceptions with officers, but as far as the foot soldiers en masse, actually were eventually evacuated by South Korea with pressure from the newly established international community in the UN. But by the way, there were other countries in the Near East that he refused to evacuate, at least for a period of time. And so at any rate, even with him gone, his soldiers gone, what do you know? The Communist Party just overwhelms in electoral votes and victories under a guy named Kim Il-sung. Now, you look at BBC videos of this, right, that seem to be, rather partial or rather impartial, especially the more contemporary they are now that the Cold War is over. And so they'll admit to American failings and so forth and misdeeds. But they concede that Kim Il-sung genuinely was very popular in North Korea. and that very likely the elections were legitimate. All right. But he didn't stop there, is what he contended is the international community in the form of the UN decided to permanently put a line through Korea at the 38th parallel. Now, remember, there's a General Assembly in the UN, and then there is a higher committee of only 5 countries that has veto power over the assembly. So they kind of arguably rule the roost. I don't think it's that way. It's that hegemonic anymore with those 5 countries, but it was back then. And of course, who ran those 5 countries? The US, because the Soviet Union wasn't a part of the UN. So we had a large part of manipulating this, getting that parallel set there. So we could stay, right, in South Korea. Well, he contended that that was American manipulation and that the Korean people, which was true, south of the 30th parallel, spoke the same language, adhered to the same customs and culture, had the same history as the North Koreans did. And that was unfair and against historical precedent to split their country in half. Well, we do know, because it was highly publicized, he traveled to the Soviet Union to meet with Joseph Stalin. And they got along very well. And we do have evidence that he asked and received the blessing of Joseph Stalin. If I were to invade the 38th parallel to unite all of my Korean people, will you militarily support me? And can I have your blessing in doing so? And Stalin said yes. And we have supposed evidence of that. So he did. In 1950, the North Koreans invaded the 38th parallel and made it very quickly all the way down to the Pusan southeast perimeter of the bottom of the Korean peninsula. They almost successfully took militarily the whole country. And the US staged a comeback. All right. The UN had a vote on it in the General Assembly, not just the 5 guys that manipulated the show. But even in the General Assembly of the UN, they agreed that this was a breach of international law and that North Korea was in the wrong and that they should raise a UN army to help the US Army to fight. So what I'm saying is it wasn't too difficult for Truman's administration to get some favorable press coverage in our country, saying, you know what, Kim Il-sung is obviously the bully. He is obviously in violation of international law. The UN is standing with us, so hence the international community is standing with us. I believe it was just 16 countries that sent soldiers into the UN contingent of the army, and then our American boys comprised the rest. And so at any rate, it looked as if, right, this was one more example of Truman coming to save the day against the Soviet Union and proving once again that the Soviet and communist countries were bullies and that their method of expansion was violent and forceful and coercive. So it was a seesaw when you read about or you watch a documentary on the fighting. We had an invasion above them at Incheon, and we surrounded them in southern Korea and then began pushing them back. And then we could have stopped at the 38th. And boy, that might have been able to resolve some tension that we have to this day with that country. But instead, Truman was persuaded by the commander in forces, Douglas MacArthur, to take all of North Korea as well, which was much more ambiguous morally under international law, etc. Right? It's one thing to just protect a sovereign country, South Korea, and push the guys back over the 38th parallel. But now you're going all the way to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, up at the very top of the Korean Peninsula, near the Yalu, or one of the main rivers that separates Korea from China. So we did that controversially and pushed all the way up And then we supposedly got to the border river itself of China. And according to certain sources, China released literally 1 million-man army against us that crossed their Yalu River into North Korea. Because remember, in 1949, not too long before this, Mao Zedong and the communists won a civil war against Chiang Kai-shek and made China communist. So now this is a communist ally of theirs in North Korea. And also with China's involvement, Stalin kind of stepped back and said, see, you no longer need my soldiers. I'll give you equipment. I'll give you officers and officials to help you with strategy. And that's all you need because you got the Chinese helping you. So again, it became more of a proxy war instead of us actually fighting Russian soldiers in Korea. So they pushed us back over the 38th parallel. And I can't remember some of the key battles that we finally won and pushed them back to the 38th parallel. And we both signed an armistice, a ceasefire. And for years and years and years, we never signed a definitive ending treaty to the Korean War. We're technically at a ceasefire. And we might even be to this day. So that 38th parallel region is very tense to this very day. And also, as an aside, MacArthur, frustrated militarily, asked that we not only continue fighting the Chinese. He was so indignant, claiming that we never crossed that river into China and that they were the ones who left their country to fight us. Because, of course, the Chinese were calling this a defensive war. MacArthur begged to differ, and he was very prideful, egotistical man, and he contended that he asked the president to drop an atomic weapon on China. And of course, Truman was seen as gung-ho by his opponents. Not all. Some he was seen as even being too soft because he allowed, quote, China to go red. Despite our military help of Chiang Kai-shek, communist Mao's enemy, and our CIA's involvement and all that, they still failed, obviously. And so at any rate, even Truman said no. As sometimes people say, right? Before you act, you should think 2 to 3 steps forward at least. If I do this, what will be a common reaction to that? Then what will be a reaction to that reaction, etc. Because by 1953, the Soviet Union had use of atomic weaponry as well. And they were an ally to not only North Korea and Kim Il-sung, but to Mao Zedong and Communist China. So Truman would not do it. MacArthur went over his head to the press, called Truman a coward, not willing to go to the extent that was needed to defeat our enemies, and Truman had him fired as the commander. So at any rate, but nevertheless, even with that drama, oh, and then you had the Berlin airlift. All right. Sorry this is so long, you guys. When we came into Berlin, our government announced that we came to an agreement with the Soviet Union because our armies met each other in Berlin. And so at first we decided to merely split Germany in half and occupying Germany. Mind you, it was supposed to be a finite period, certainly not indefinitely, eventually allowing the German people to have their own sovereign country, but not for now, not immediately after the war. So we agreed to share the western half of Germany with England and France, and Russia had all of the eastern half. Well, I don't recall the specifics because it was controversial, though. I do recall that. Is we made one exception. As we said, Berlin is far into the east under Soviet territory, but Berlin is too important of a city to be left solely in Soviet hands. So we, through the international community, ensured or maybe even arguably bullied our way into Berlin and decided to split Berlin in half as well. The western side of Berlin to the Allies, England, France, and US, and the eastern sector of Berlin to the Soviet Union. Okay. For years, there was no wall, but it was tense. You could feel it because right at that border of Berlin, there were Soviet and American troops with automatic weapons. In some cases, literally across the street, staring each other down. So Berlin, particularly, and Germany was a very sore spot, a source of tension in this Cold War. Well, there were efforts by the U.S. to rebuild Germany, just as we were rebuilding Japan. And we allowed in a lot of commercial licenses to people in Western Berlin. They started a lot of restaurants, nightclubs, etc. And people in Eastern Berlin would oftentimes flock to Western Berlin with our permission, just temporarily, to visit family members that they were split from, and to also to enjoy the nightlife. Well, Soviet Union felt, particularly Stalin felt like we were being manipulative and trying to lure the East Berliners to our sector. So they began putting up barbed wire, etc., having these checkpoints, etc. Well, there was a rally that erupted in Berlin, in Eastern Berlin, of mainly college students and intellectuals and so forth. And they read out a decree and they asked the international community to basically ensure their basic human rights and freedoms under the Soviet Union in the Soviet sector of East Berlin. It was brought over the radio waves of the most well-connected radio company, RCA, in the world at that time, and it got a lot of publicity. Well, Stalin became furious, and he cracked down on them. He sent the tanks and the soldiers in. He had some people shot. He broke up crowds. He arrested people, etc. And mind you, the press covered some of this. So Truman's diehards said, we need to invade East Berlin with tanks and all to liberate these people. And to just, while we're at it, just take Eastern Germany. Truman didn't want to go there. He didn't want another war. So instead, he, through whatever communications, I don't know what means of communications it was, he informed Stalin that he was going to fly B-59s, B-52 bombers over the border of Berlin into the eastern sector, but that promising him there was no military objective, that they were unarmed, and that they were simply going to send supplies to the East Berliners as a humanitarian act. Because what I didn't mention, in Stalin, in his anger, he issued an economic blockade around Eastern Berlin to punish the people for that act of defiance. And he was kind of starving them into submission. So this was known as the Berlin Airlift. And we flew over and we dropped food, blankets, and clothing, coal, lots of coal so they could burn for their houses to keep themselves warm in the winter. There was even a guy named Guy Halverson who was known as the Candyman. And the kids would gather there at certain sectors and await him, his arrival. And he would drop Hershey Kisses and other candies to him from the plane. Well, they have pictures covering this on the news, and Stalin is angrily shaking his head, smoking a cigarette, watching it all happen, but letting it happen. So again, this made our country look good. This made us look like we were the humanitarian side. Stalin was the bully, and Truman was doing the wise thing. and we finally had a guy, right, as I put here rather dramatically at the bottom, a new sheriff was in town. So now Soviet bullying would come to a halt. And then number 4, rather the last one, rather predictably for me, is I contend that the very attributes we just described in the previous number about Truman, being productive, being useful, being necessary as a healthy deterrent to the Soviet Union as a bully, may have actually made things worse, may have exacerbated Cold War tensions. First of all, remember, by most accounts, Joseph Stalin was like legally paranoid. Okay. And so the development of the CIA, then we had a guy named Mossadegh in Iran and a guy named Guatemalan. Oh, shoot. It'll come to me hopefully soon. But the Guatemalan president as well, we had them overthrown because simply they did not pass our duck test. If it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. It was that simple to the CIA. So if they were for even something as moderate as having national rules on empowering labor unions, that was a red flag. If they expropriated or nationalized foreign companies' properties in their country, that was a huge red flag. If they reallocated property from wealthy corporations to poor peasants, that was a humongous red flag. That they were secretly, whether they acknowledged it or not, communists. And remember, by this time, it already was an assumption that hadn't been articulated yet. It would be articulated in the next presidency of Eisenhower, but the whole domino theory. And the argument was that if we allow one country to turn communist, first and foremost, it's going to make us look weak. And our allies in the UN and in NATO, the military wing of the UN, might drop out as our allies because they don't want a weak ally who is likely going to lose to the Soviet Union. So we have to appear strong, and we can't look like we lose anywhere in the world to communism. That's why China was such a big deal. Okay. Secondly, with communism is the idea is that communism gains momentum, that it empowers and emboldens the leaders of that country to want to expand to their adjacent countries. And lastly, that if those countries are in the third world and they're poor, their neighbors can easily become enticed by communism. Because think about it. If you have virtually nothing and you're going hungry, an ideology that says take from the rich and give to the poor and equally allocate everything to everybody, that's going to sound luring, very alluring to a poor country. So it was known as the domino theory. And so we could not allow, supposedly, any countries amongst our allies or neutral to fall to communism. So we had coups or military takeovers. We had assassinations. In Italy, we manipulated the parliamentary elections to make sure that the communists lost. One of the main methods we used was the Catholic Church. We demanded, I don't know how we demanded, but we really kind of strong-armed the Catholic clergy in Italy to tell their parishioners in their churches during Mass that if they chose the Communist Party, they were going against God and Jesus Christ. Because remember, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and following Marx claimed that religion is a Vicodin pill, is the opiate of the masses, and they declared themselves atheistic. All right. Then also, there is evidence that Truman had in mind, at least partially, if not his main reason, that he knew that dropping the 2 bombs on Japan at the end of the war would intimidate the Soviet Union. And we have evidence of that. And that may have sped up the Soviet Union's atomic weaponry program rather than deterring it. Then we first formed an alliance of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as military allies in the case of war with the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact as its rival and counterpart. So we formed a clique, a military clique against the Soviet Union before they did against us. So this may have exacerbated the anger, the aggression, the paranoia and distrust of Joseph Stalin more than it deterred him. He saw the ruthless ways in which we dealt with espionage. We had them executed. The Rosenbergs, a husband and wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a guy named Chevalier, and Alger Hiss, almost all connected to the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, devising the bomb. We found evidence, and from what I understand, they actually were guilty of passing secrets to making a bomb out of splitting an atom to the Soviet Union. Julius Rosenberg was just a janitor, and he got access to papers and was paid to share them. He and his wife were both executed. Oh, and there's the Guatemalan president's name, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, known as Arbenz. So to some people on this last number, the aggression, the kind of very aggressive policies of Harry Truman may at times and in some ways may have made things worse rather than better. All right, I'm sorry this went on so long. Do you guys have any questions or comments? Make sure I have all your names. Which I do. Again, on this one, on my notes, I'm going to add 10 points because it took so long and you stood with me. So whatever your raw score is, I'm going to add 10 to it on this assignment. All right, so can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel like you've learned something, like you got a good head start on this assignment? Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, good. Good. All right, so I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to post this as I've yet to do. All right, so as usual, same method of doing it, and due Sunday evening. You guys have a good week, okay? Thank you for attending. I appreciate it's always the same familiar names, and I doubly appreciate that. Your faithfulness in attending these. All right, so I'll see you later, okay?
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You as well. Thank you.